So thank you, everybody, and welcome. So for those of you, I know I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those of you that are new, as I just alluded to, we were founded in 1925 by Reginald Truitt. So yes, this is our 100-year celebration of our institution, the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. We are the oldest state-supported marine laboratory on the US East Coast. And we're one of 6 constituent members of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And we have our sister laboratories, the Appalachian Laboratory up in Frostburg. We have our Home Point Laboratory in Cambridge. We have Maryland Sea Grant that's at College Park, the Integration and Application Network that's in Annapolis, and the Institute of Marine and Environmental Technology in Baltimore. So you can see we span the whole range of Maryland, and that's really important because we focus on everything in science, from genes to ecosystems, from the land to the sea. So we are a renowned world leader in solving the many environmental problems that are facing us today, also educating our next generation of environmental leaders, and the key part is our public service. So we actually have a mission to improve and preserve Maryland's natural resources, and address our pressing environmental problems. And we do this through cutting-edge research, advancing our scientific knowledge, and most importantly, sharing this with you all and our policymakers and resource managers to provide solutions. And we were recently honored by the Maryland Senate with a resolution on the 25th of February this year, recognizing our 100-year contribution to the state of Maryland. So we are also a leading institute. We are the leading institute in Maryland for training our next generation of environmental scientists and professionals. So we also kicked off, as I just said, it's our 100th year. So fittingly, CBL kicked off our 100-year anniversary for UMCES, and fittingly in the R.V. Truitt Laboratory, which is the building across the road. And so we will have a lot of events. Tracy is one of our wonderful event planners, development team for this. And so the QR code and the website, if you just Google UMCES 100 years, it'll take you to the website and tell you a little bit about some of the activities that we have coming out throughout the year. So that is what this series is celebrating. It is celebrating our 100 years anniversary. And so it was a century ago that Reginald Truitt, he was an early pioneer, a true visionary and advocate for environmental health. He established CBL right here on Solomon's Island with a bold ambition to understand the intricate balance of our ecosystem, combining the research on the organisms that were here, particularly oysters and blue crabs, understanding that there were declines and trying to figure that out, and looking at the importance of the ecosystem as a whole, including water quality. So on April 29th, bottom right there, our professor and previous director here, Tom Miller, will be actually speaking to R.V. Truitt's legacy here at CBL. On April 22nd, we will be talking to that long-term, not talking to the data set, we'll be talking about the long-term data set on water quality here. And some of you have walked past and driven past that climate stripes. That's actually the temperature data from our water off the Solomon's Pier. And so that data set has been really instrumental in effectiveness of restoration activities, in policies here in the Chesapeake Bay, even those simplest measurements of water temperature that's providing us with new insights today on things that we didn't even think about 100 years ago. No, climate change wasn't a word 100 years ago. So now we're understanding the warming waters. That data set can speak to that. So on your way out, have a look at that sign, and that speaks for itself, what's happening to our water temperature. So today we have our President Emeritus, Dr. Don Boesch, who will be talking about our 100-year history of UMCES. I'm going to leave that till later. Next week, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Ralph Eshelman from the Calvert Marine Museum. Thank you so much. And he will provide a wonderful historic perspective of Solomon's Island. So many things that I didn't know at all about this island, and I've been here 24 years, so thank you for that. On April 29th, also in the audience, Professor Dave Secor will be highlighting another of our CBL hero, Dr. Mansuetti. And you can sort of see, if anyone's wandered around campus here, you can sort of see the theme here. We love to name buildings after our heroes. And my absolute favorite, I'm a marine toxicologist, my absolute favorite, of course, is this building. This building, the Bernie Fowler Laboratory, is celebrating a true hero of the Chesapeake Bay, the late Senator Bernie Fowler. So as we reflect on the last 100 years, we're reminded of the countless contributions the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory has made in fisheries management, in water quality, in ecological restoration, in biodiversity, and the broader impacts of human activity on our natural resources. So our laboratory's work has not only advanced the frontiers of science, but also directly informed policies and practices that restore our wonderful Chesapeake Bay and also beyond in many other global ecosystems. But what I really like what I really like to celebrate is our community, our scientists, our students, our staff, and of course, all of you, our supporters. So we've always been a place of collaboration and community, bringing together scientists, educators, policymakers, and the public. It's really important to engage. We all have a shared responsibility in preserving our natural environment. So talking of people, I unfortunately I'm already running out of time. I can't speak to all the wonderful research that's being done here and our wonderful researchers, but I do want to highlight just a couple. So just recently, hot off the press, one of our professors, Jackie Grebmeyer, if any of you came to the series in the fall, I spoke to Jackie's work in the Arctic and their long-term importance of their long-term data sets and looking at habitat and organism changes up in the Arctic. Well, Jackie Grebmeyer just received the University System of Maryland Regents Award for Excellence in Scholarship and Research. This is the highest honor that the board bestows and recognizes exemplary faculty achievement. So she'll have a ceremony actually this week at Towson University to recognize that. We also have a new director here at CBL. So Dr. Beth Polidoro will join CBL here on August 1st. She is a renowned expert in marine science and environmental chemistry, and she'll be joining CBL from Arizona State University, where she was Deputy Director of the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes, also Assistant Director of the School of Mathematical and Natural Sciences. I also want to highlight something else that just happened recently. Our wonderful friends and wonderful donors, Brian Hockheimer and Marjorie Wax. We just received a $1 million donation for an endowed professorship. This is really a landmark donation. This establishes CBL's first endowed professorship, and it's named in honor of Professor Tom Miller at the back there. So the goal of this is to recruit emerging leaders in environmental science, attract those that are just going to be transformative in the field of environmental science. So as we look ahead, we have lots of challenges ahead. Climate change, habitat loss, pollution, the ever-increasing demands on our natural resources, that requires innovative solutions, interdisciplinary collaboration, and an unwavering resolve. So if the past 100 years have taught us anything, it's that this laboratory, this community is more than capable of rising to that occasion. So you all just drove past it, that wonderful new building there on our right now, right next to the Truitt building. That is our Chesapeake Analytics Collaborative building. It's a $22 million investment from the state of Maryland. It's got all the walls inside, it's looking fantastic. And that is going to be a state-of-the-art meeting space. Again, for all the environmental problems that we have right now, we need to bring everybody together to understand, to even know what questions to ask, as well as provide the solutions and actionable solutions at a fast pace. So we have high-end AV equipment going in there, a lot of different meeting space. And this also ties in well with our new initiative at UMCES for our global Chesapeake Global Collaborative effort. So finally, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't have an ask. So a number of our programs rely on donations, including supporting our students and specific research projects and outreach programs. So in celebration of 100 years, my goal is to reach 100 donations this year. You can see I've already penciled in some at the back. That was me. I've kicked off this event by making a donation. So thank you all for your continued support. So in closing, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to everybody here that's contributed to CBL's success. Just turning out tonight, showing your support. Thank you so much. It's very much appreciated. We can't do any of this without you. So thank you. Now, moving on to the star of the show tonight, our Professor and President Emeritus, Dr. Donald Boesch. Just a brief overview. He's a professor of marine science, biological oceanographer, and from 1990 to 2017, he was president of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. Also between 2006 and 2017, the Vice Chancellor for Environmental Sustainability at the University System of Maryland. So he's a global leader in so many things, I can't list them all, but really focusing on informing policies for the protection and restoration and sustainable use of our coastal ecosystems. He's been an official advisor to federal agencies, the Chesapeake Bay program, 5 Maryland governors, and the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. And actually a recent report just came out on that. He was appointed by President Obama to the National Commission on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It's hard to believe that was 15 years ago now. And has a long record of service to the National Academies of Sciences. And in 2015, in fact, joined, where is Walter Boynton with another one of our heroes here. Thank you, Walter. Heroes here at CBL, was also recognized as Admiral of the Chesapeake. So we are here tonight. Dr. Boesch has put together a new book. It's called Predictive Ecology. It's available outside if you would like a copy, overviewing the history of UMCES for the last 100 years. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Boesch, and thank you all again for joining us.
Thanks so very much, Karis. I'm really pleased that you turned out tonight, and so many people actually online as well, as part of the celebration of the 100th years of starting with the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory, as we'll tell you about, and then evolving into a much larger multi-campus organization that Karis talked. It's been my honor to serve for 27 of those years as the CEO, as the president of UMCES. And it's been a remarkable experience for me. So much so, even though I've retired 7 years ago, I felt it's my duty to come back and kind of help encapsulate this history as we celebrate this wonderful anniversary. Before I forget it, because I will get round up in what I'm speaking, I do want to recognize my partner in crime, who served as my editor here, and he's a wonderful writer. If you know him, he was the communications director for Maryland Sea Grant for many years. Jack Greer. Jack here is the editor of the book. And I also want to acknowledge, I believe they're on watching online, some of the family members of Gene Cronin, who was the long-term director here. Both Dave and John Cronin, I think John is out in British Columbia, are watching online, and Gene Cronin's nephew, Tom Cronin, who's actually a marine scientist himself, I think is joining us online as well. This is the book, and Karis already told you about it. But what I wanted to tell you about why I called it predictive ecology. Well, it turns out that this term, predictive ecology, was developed in the early 70s when a major change in organization of the center took place, and we had new legislation created. And I thought it was kind of remarkable because Yeah, we all know what ecology is now, but in the early 70s, it was not necessarily a household word, number one. And secondly, ecology was seen as like, sort of forensic almost. What happened? Who killed Cock Robin? What went wrong? And now this is a directive to make predictions about the future rather than just about the past. So I thought that was an apropos theme for the book. As was mentioned, this whole thing started out in 1925, more or less about Reginald Truitt keeps changing his mind of exactly what the starting date was. But as what he called the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. And then the organization then broadened and morphed and changed names a number of times. It became, in the 1941, I'll talk about this, it became essentially a separate separate agency called the Maryland Department of Research and Education. In 61, we went back to our birthplace in the University of Maryland. We became part of the University of Maryland, the broader University of Maryland. And in 1973, this legislation that I was talking about moved us into the Center for Environmental and Estuarine Studies, and then we changed the name again in 1997 as UMCES, University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. But we all owe our origins to this man. It's kind of a remarkable guy. This is William K. Brooks. He was not a professor at CBL or University of Maryland. He was a professor at Johns Hopkins. In fact, he was one of the first professors hired when Johns Hopkins was created. He was hired in about, I think it was about 1876. Hopkins was an interesting institution formed in the model of a European university with not so much emphasis on undergraduate training, but advanced research with research led by research professors. So it really served as a new model for American higher education. And Brooks was one of their first faculty members. And he actually was an amazing teacher of biology and it changed the way biology is taught in higher education. But he developed a really interest in the oyster and in the Chesapeake Bay since he was here. He had experience in the early days at Harvard with an idea of a summer marine laboratory in New England. And he took that idea and he came here, and very quickly he established what he called the Chesapeake Zoological Laboratory. Sound familiar, huh? But he didn't locate it here at Hopkins or University of Maryland. The first year he had this, during the summer, he established his laboratory at Fort Wool, which is at the mouth of Hampton Roads in Virginia, James River. If you ever cross the bridge tunnel over to Norfolk, you might be able to see it out on the left, almost a little mini Alcatraz sitting out there, government facility. And he held it there. The second summer, he said, well, we're going to move it around. He held this laboratory in Crisfield on the Eastern Shore. And he said, oh, but we found these barges with the little houses on them. He was going to do that all from these barges. Well, that was a great idea, except they got eaten alive with mosquitoes, and they really couldn't function. So they then moved back over to Fort Wool that year. Thereafter, he moved Chesapeake Biological Laboratory all over the place. Many years he held it in Beaufort, North Carolina, down on the Carolina coast, but he went to Bermuda. The Bahamas, I'm sorry, and Jamaica with the Chesapeake Zoological Laboratory, bringing these students and other researchers to work together on things. He also, when he got involved and interested in oysters, he was really ahead of his time, because this was in the 1800s when he saw that we were really over-harvesting oysters. We were strip mining them basically, and that this was not the way to do in terms of sustainable fishery, but also not a smart thing to do in terms of a profitable fishery. So he began to advocate more cultivation, farming, if you will, with respect to oysters. Got in a lot of trouble, a lot of controversies, but he had some influence, not so much in Maryland, but in Virginia in terms of how they do that. So that's why leasing of oyster grounds was long time held in Virginia and not so much in Maryland. As a result of that work he did for the state, he went back into the Bay for the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory one summer. Where did he go? He went back to the area near Fort Weld, but he went to Hampton Institute, historically Black institution, and basically rented the maintenance building. Yeah, think of the times. This man's going into doing this at a HBCU, you know, historically Black institution, and having it. Remarkable guy. He published a really interesting book on the oyster, published multiple times, the first time in 1891. So here we go to our founder, Reginald Truitt. And Truitt was a very interesting man. He was born and raised in a little community called Box Iron, which is near Snow Hill, and on the eastern shore, on the seaside eastern shore. His father and his he came from a very old colonial family. They're first Truitt to arrive in the colonies in Virginia, actually, on the Virginia eastern shore initially, was in 1635. So he's multi-generation Truitts on the eastern shore. His father and grandfather were ship captains. They were involved in the coastwide transport from New England down to South America. And he did some of that himself when he was a young man. He has, if you go over in the quadrangle right across the street here, you'll see the anchor, which he donated, his family donated to the lab, which is from his family origin and traditions of that period. His mother was well educated, very literate person. His father was out making money with nature, growing oysters and so on. Unlike the Bay side, the oyster growers over there actually kind of farmed oysters, and so he was much more receptive to this idea. He was initially perhaps best known for his dancing skills when he went to college, because he liked ragtime music and was good at dancing. But he also was a star athlete. So he was a track star and particularly lacrosse star. So after he got his master's degree, after he got his bachelor's degree, he actually got it right at the beginning of World War I. So he went in, was in the Army Air Corps, and being trained as a pilot. Came back and taught high school on the Eastern Shore, and then went to graduate school. And then at that time, because of his athletic prowess, he became the lacrosse coach at College Park, University of Maryland. Very successful one. He won championships, several of them. And that put him at odds with the next person I'll talk about, a guy by the name of Curly Byrd, who was the football coach at College Park. But before we get there, he was because of his upbringing and his outlook, he's a very influential man. He was easily moved in social and political circles in Annapolis, and so that was part of his success, that he had abilities to do that. So here is the coaching staff at College Park in 1925 from the yearbook, and you see Reg Truitt, the lacrosse coach, and Curly Byrd. Byrd was, like Truitt, was also from a seafood producing family on the Eastern Shore, and both of them went on to get PhDs. Now you'd think these two guys have a lot in common and they'd be tight buddies, right? Think again. They were very different personalities and approaches. Truitt became very interested in the research that he was doing. He wanted to spend more time down here, looking at places during work. And he did coaching, but that wasn't his first priority. Byrd was jealous of him in a way, because College Park, University of Maryland's record about the time was like 0 and 10, or something of that sort. But what really got Truitt was that Byrd wanted to build a football powerhouse, an athletic powerhouse, and was putting pressure on him and other faculty members to pass athletes without doing anything. So he was really objective to that. So at that point, he said, enough of this. I resigned as the coach. I'm going down and spending my time in the field, and I want to do this field research. At that time, he actually began having using a fisherman's shack here at Solomon's. And he said, we're going to do something bigger time. And so he's looking for a place to do it. And he got the church, Episcopal church, to let him use the parish house, which was that on the waterfront here. And he got to use the parish house and bring students and so on here during the summer. So that's how it all started. He remarkably, he was able to get the powers that be, both in the natural resource agencies and in the governor in particular, members of the legislature, to come up with the cash to build a laboratory. Now, this was an act of the General Assembly done in 1921, just months before the stock market crash. I mean, that stock market crash, not the one now, the one back then. And then the Depression struck in. So he was running up against the tide in this way to have it done. So he nonetheless got the money to build it. Then the first thing one of the things he had to do, because he had the Federal Bureau of Fisheries involved in it as well, they insisted there be a process to determine the location. Now, he was already working down here, and it really proved an ideal location because, he didn't have to take the ferry over to the other side and came down lower in the state where the salinity was higher. He could do more research and a lot of seafood processing and so on. Seafood industry was big here. But we had to go through this process. One of the two contenders were Cambridge and Crisfield. The citizens of Solomon's basically sweetened the deal by offering the space, the land. They donated the land for this. So we owe that to the people of Solomon's. He then, but they looked at the alternatives. One of the alternatives, the one near Cambridge, was the donor also wanted to donate land and have it near his property. And this was one of the members of the DuPont family. And so exactly the process, I don't know, but the decision was made to build it here at Solomon's. So the lab was under construction and then built, completed in 1932. The building still looks pretty much like this right out here, and now called Bevan Hall. But look at the island. What's all this dark stuff around the island? This was unbelievable. This was Clearwater area. These are grass beds that extended out to the channels then. And Walter, how long has that been gone now? It's
1970.
1970. Since 1970, basically there's nothing. Seagrass is essentially locally extinct here. A little bit trying to bring it back, but it's hard. And so you'll see you see this is the lab. This is the parish house was just over here. And the other thing that happened soon after this picture was taken, there was a major storm, a hurricane, that really eroded this shoreline back. And so used to be that shoreline slope right to the bay, right to the water. And then with that erosion, they built the seawall basically, and as well as the state road that now is in front of the lab. So Truitt had this idea, which I think has really been a guiding principle for us over the years, in that he saw that when we do research, research that he wanted to do was both basic and applied. He didn't see the distinction. He said, you need to advance knowledge and then apply it in a way. And so whether pure or applied, there's really no line of demarcation. The other thing he was really committed to is that it's not the duty of a researcher who's funded by society is not just to do the research, but to disseminate that knowledge for its practical use. So these were two guiding principles that he had. The other, of course, is he wanted a place for education. And so he figured out, first of all, university would give him nothing. In fact, he was always trying to be jerked back because, he was supposed to be teaching at College Park and they didn't have the money and the state should pay it. And then the state said the university should pay it, back and forth. So he was always caught betwixt and between. But he did work out an arrangement that he created essentially a consortium of Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, and the other Maryland colleges and universities at the time, including Goucher, St. John's, Washington, and Western Maryland now, colleges were part of this. And the deal is they could use the lab during the summer, send students down and so on, if they paid $100 a summer. And that was to pay $1 a day for board at Bowen's over here. Right? So, and so he had students living in the upstairs, the attic of now Bevan Hall and so on is going. The other thing that Ray Morgan, who used to work here, one of our long-term faculty members, told me is that this, if you don't look closely at this sign out in front that Kara showed, you see it said founded by R.B. Truitt, but the founded looks funny. It looks like it was like added on to it. And originally, apparently, according to Ray, it said erected by R.B. Truitt. And he thought that was a little, not, you know, a little off color, if you will, if you will, and that he insisted that this be changed to founded after he went out. The other thing he said about this, and it really characterized the nature of this organization and many others like it, is that when you get people who live and work at a place, students, faculty members, support staff, and so on, it becomes a community. And so he says the feature of this work was the delightful experience for teacher and student alike, a camaraderie affair. So this is something, again, that's characterized the nature of this laboratory over the years, and the center, all of the center's laboratories. Now, just as he was going, he was having more problems with Curly Bird at the university. Curly Bird, by the way, because they fired the president, Curly Bird was then promoted to be the president of College Park and was for many years. And he basically divorced. Truitt just made a deal, the legislature approved it, to make this institution a state agency and to put it under the natural resources governance system in the state, and to shortly thereafter he resigned his faculty position, which he had held for over 20 years to do this. Now, this was in 1941. Guess what was happening in 1941? World War II broke out. So if you can imagine the impact of World War II on this laboratory and on this community. First of all, the funding, state funding is difficult. Secondly, young men are not going to college and coming down here, they're going to war. And thirdly, this happens to be a place where the U.S. decided this was necessary, this place right, we're in was necessary to win the war. So this Solomon's changed from a sleepy backwater place to a place that trained some 82,000 men who were going to war on amphibious landing craft. So just across the harbor here on the peninsula, Dowell Peninsula, is where that facility was. Imagine 82,000 young men, and then all the support staff and so on, the training. They practiced landing out of Drum Point and so on. They also had a mine facility on the other side of the highway, where the recreational center is. So because of the huge population influx, the change in the community was enormous. And it even included to the point where the water supply to supply them was making everyone's wells go dry because it drew down the groundwater as a result of it. Truitt himself he was always crafty guy to figure out how to wait. He owned a boat, which was used here for research purposes. He also, had fun recreation with his family on the boat. He owned it, but he did a deal, use it for research, but the maintenance people will take care of it and keep it functioning. But we share it that way. And so he did that. Then that was commandeered because it's hard to imagine, but we were worried about invasion. And we were about boats coming up the Chesapeake Bay, German boats coming up the Chesapeake Bay. So it was taken for patrol uses and so on. So amazing change that took place as a result of that. So after the war, there a number of things happened. as a result of that. After the war, first of all, things got back to being more functional. There were a lot of folks who came back from the war, who went to college, went to school or trained, and came back. And a lot of the folks that came and worked at the lab were veterans. Among them, this gentleman next to Gene Cronin, who became the rector. I'll tell you about him in just a minute. Romeo Mansuetti, which Karen's pointed out, Mansuetti Hall over here. But back a little bit to Gene Cronin. So in 1954, Reg Truitt decides it's time to retire. He was about 65. I don't know if there was mandatory retirement then, but that's about when he retired. And who was hired to replace him was Gene Cronin. Gene, like Reg Truitt, was a Maryland guy, educated, born, raised, educated here in Maryland, all through graduate school. And he was from Aberdeen in the Upper Bay. And he had worked with Truitt as a graduate student, worked on blue crabs, and was working here at the lab when he got a job offer to go to the University of Delaware, so that the University of Delaware has a lab sort of analogous to this one, based in Lewis, Delaware. So Gene was the first director of that lab. Then when the vacancy became back here in Maryland, he came back and became the director then. The department, if you will, Department of Research and Education, including not only CBL, but it began to develop this work on the forests and wildlife and so on of the state on land as well. So there was a program that developed here at CBL on that, but it basically outgrew the space that was available, moved to Annapolis, ultimately then moved on to the College Park campus. So he was director from 1955 on. So in 1960, more about, we had an election. Oh, well, first of all, in 1954, the year that Truitt retired, his good friend Curly Byrd ran for governor. He lost. And one of the reasons he lost is that he's a Democrat, but he got the Republican winner, McKeldin, got the votes of Black people and of educated white people, because Byrd was segregationist. He believed separate higher education. He believed Black people should go to Morgan State and other schools, Princess Anne Academy, now UMES, and things of that sort. So Truitt wrote a very nasty letter to the Baltimore Sun, which was never published, complaining about Byrd at that time. Nonetheless, he lost, so things go on. And then in 1960, more or less, McKeldin finishes his term, and and a new governor, Governor Tawes was elected. Now, one of the things, Tawes was Curly Byrd's first cousin from Crisfield. So his cousin had lost the election, no longer the president of College Park. So he appoints him the head of the conservation, the tidewater fisheries thing, to which CBL would be responsible. And so that was enough for both Byrd, for both Truitt and Gene Cronin, and they worked behind the scenes with the university and with the Legislative General Assembly to get the university out of a separate state agency and back into the University of Maryland, where it became the Natural Resources Institute. So it had a number of, and Walter tells me these stories, Walter Boynton tells me these stories, because he knew some of these guys. It had this whole cohort of veterans who were working here at the lab. Some of these veterans have just remarkable experiences. Romeo Mansuetti was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was captured. He was in a German prisoner of war camp. There are many others. These guys were tough. They had been through a lot. They were focused and dedicated, but they didn't like authority very much. So you've ever seen Catch-22, you know. So Mansuetti was a superstar. I mean, young man, got his PhD, and then did all this publication. Dave Secor could tell you the impact of his work on larval fishes and fishes generally is quite remarkable. But he died when he was only 40 years old. Remarkable. I mean, just think what he could have done. So one of the things that Gene Cronin did, and Mansuetti was his partner with, he said, we needed a journal to be able to make sure that all the good work that's being done, you know, you can publish in national journals and so on, but there's a lot of things that are locally important. We need a journal to make sure that these things get out and published. So he created a journal which was called Chesapeake Science. Fast forward, Gene and some other folks create a society, Estuarine Research Society, Atlantic Estuarine Research Society, and then that becomes into a national organization, Estuarine Research Federation, and he donates the journal, he gives the journal to this national society, and now it is one of the premier journals in the field called Estuaries and Coast. So a contribution we made to the field as a result of it. In addition to CBL, and at the time, when this was happening, we finished Corey Hall over here, which was on the quadrangle. That was built when it was still a state agency, but also he inherited, as part of the deal moving into the university, he inherited some baggage. One of them is this laboratory, Marine Products Laboratory in Crisfield, which was by a department, microbiology, whatever, on campus. And it was built presumably, apparently, because Tawes, who before being governor was the comptroller, he wanted to have a university facility that he could look out his home in Crisfield and see, you know. So it did, you know, seafood safety type things and so on. And so that was brought into the Natural Resources Institute, which was called. And then Gene then thought, how do we think about the other part of the state, part of the West, forgotten part to the West, and all the resources? The idea at the time that there's a lot of attention to Appalachia and what things were going on there, and poverty and the other things in the environment. So they created a sort of an outpost called the part of the Inland Resources Division in LaVale, out in Western Maryland, just on the other side of Cumberland, at this former gas station, I guess it was. So into the 60s, and these are when I came aboard as a graduate student down in Virginia, these are some of the guys that I remember who really made an impact on the research that CBL was doing at the time. One of them is Joe Mahersky, this fellow over here on the left, who worked on fishes, but he was brought in really to deal, at the time, one of the big issues was power plants. They were building the Chalk Point power plant, controversy about what impact that would have. Previously, power plants were on rivers, you know, the fat flowing, and he used the water to cool the plant. And now you're dealing with power plants on salty tidal waters, where the tide goes back and forth. So there's questions about entrainment and the thermal impacts on the organisms. So Joe came in and led that. We had CBL had a field station up there by the power plant, and Halloween Point.
Yeah, Halloween Point, yeah.
Which some people then call it Harrowing Point later on. Walter Boynton started out there. And the other, so he was a real force. Dave Flemmer worked on phytoplankton. Bob Biggs, the geologist. Don Hindley, I'll talk about a little bit. Bob Ulanowitz, who was here for many, many years, became really influential researchers over the years. So one of the things these guys did is that they became friends in the community, friends of the community. Joe in particular was an avid baseball fan. He started a softball team, and they played within the community and so on. And they got to meet and interact with this guy, Bernie Fowler, who was concerned about what he saw as the degradation of the Patuxent River, as you know, and this is him on this annual expedition to see how deep he could see his feet, you know, into the murky waters. Going, and there's Walter there, and your daughter. And now this was later than the early 70s, but and the other guy, Nick with the beard, is an interesting guy as well. The Bard of the Chesapeake Bay, he's often called. He wrote the song called Chesapeake Born, you might have heard. And apparently he wrote it in the attic of when he was living up there, attic of of the main building. This was important because here we had scientists talking to he was a county official, and he got the other counties to sue the state and federal government to dealing with the problems that they were uncovering with all of the pollution coming down because of the growth in the upper Patuxent watershed. All of that development in suburban Washington was taking place. Sewage treatment plants and so on were discharging all this, land clearing and so on was degrading. Principal reasons that we saw the Patuxent being degraded. So remarkably, these scientists helped educate Bernie Fowler, but also even to the point of going to court and testifying on behalf of the counties against the state, which is their employer. And there was a lot of pushback on that. So at the time, the head of the Natural Resources Department, I've seen the letters, was writing the person in my position at the time, telling them, fire this guy, Don Hundley, because of his, he's outrageous, his activism, he's costing us money. He's telling people the river is polluted. We don't want people to think that. We want to think it's wonderful and great on the Chesapeake Bay and so on. The other person who they got involved with, in contact with Gene Cronin in particular, is this guy, Senator Mac Mathias, a moderate Republican senator from Frederick, Maryland. And he was, Gene knew him from the time he was in the General Assembly. So they had a good friendship. When Mac Mathias went to Washington and became a senator, a representative, and then a senator, Gene, the other thing that happened during this period, early 70s, is Tropical Storm Agnes, a record flood event. It flooded not only the Susquehanna River, but all of the rivers leading into the river. Really impacted the bay in a major way, and it didn't recover very quickly. So there was great concern about what was going on in the bay. So Gene helped Mac Mathias do this tour around the bay, talk to people about what was going on. And then Mac Mathias went back and got legislation passed. He had to push several years to get EPA to do a major study of the Chesapeake and what its problems were. Gene also, during the 60s and into the 70s, developed a very good working relationship with the other leaders, institutional leaders within the Bay, scientific leaders. These guys were called the Bay Triumvirate. Gene's on the right. Don Pritchard, who was the director of the Chesapeake Bay Institute at Johns Hopkins in the middle, and Bill Hargis, who was the director of Virginia Institute of Marine Science. They, for the first time, began to work together of the Bay as a whole. So when Agnes took place, without any kind of guarantee that they would be paid for it, because they had to act quickly, they sent out field teams of researchers from each of the three institutions, worked collaboratively to be able to document the impacts of the flood. They also worked together to try to understand the whole physical system, to build a model. They're going to build a physical model of the bay over on the eastern shore. And carried on this tradition of collaboration among our institutions. So one of the other things that happened in the early 70s is a forced gift, I put it that way. So what happened is that you had the Natural Resources Institute, had a lab in Crisfield, out in Western Maryland, at College Park, and then the community of Cambridge, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, had possession of this amazing property, Horns Point, that was donated to the city by this gentleman on the left, Francis DuPont, member of the DuPont family, but his father was the cousin of the other guy, the DuPont, who wanted to put CBL over there way back when. And he donated it to the city. The city wanted in the worst way to have a college, a university, an educational institution of some sort. If you've been to Cambridge, you know it's got problems and it's a bit depressed. So the question is, how can we do it? We have an higher education institution of higher education will change everything. So they tried many times. The university turned them down numerous times. They tried to get a private college to be built there. Didn't work out. So they then put pressure on on this second gentleman, who was Marvin Mandel, who was the governor of Maryland. And Mandel was then trying to deal with politics of the Eastern Shore. So he said, sure, we'll help you. And put a lot of pressure on the university system to take this property. But the university said, we'll take the property, but we're not going to build a campus there. You know, the university campus, we already have, they just built the UMBC just started. They had UMES, what became UMES, and Salisbury State on the Eastern Shore. We don't need it. But ask the faculty at College Park, oh, how about an environmental center? Now, didn't they already have an environmental program in the Natural Resources Institute? So they proceeded here with the idea that this would be kind of very multi-media. Agriculture has a lot of different things in it, not just the Bay things. And it would be also a place where people in the humanities, social sciences, and so on can come and work and talk. And so they said, yes, we're going to go ahead with it. Poor Gene Cronin, he's got this reality that this new thing is developing that seems to overlap a lot with what he's running. Problem is that Mandel didn't like CBL, didn't like Gene Cronin because of the power plant controversies. So at the time, CBL had gotten a grant to build an oyster hatchery here. Mandel said, we're not going to put the oyster hatchery. We put it at Horn Point. So that was a dictate. This was the president of the university, was Wilson Elkins, the third gentleman. Of course, he said, I got this problem with the governor, we're going to accommodate him. But they developed all these grandiose plans to build this campus and all these buildings, and they never followed through on it. They hired as director Pete Wagner, who was an engineer, electrical engineer, solid state physicist, to run this environmental center. And he tried, he actually did some pretty remarkable things, but he then had to deal with the fact that Gene Cronin and the rest of the NRI, CBL, told him that they were under this new institution. So that's how it got developed. Having said, and so they had this plan, how this was all going to work out. And you can see all the labs. We had CBL, we had Horn Point, we had Appalachian Lab, and Inland College Park, Crisfield, and they even wanted to build another one on the seaside by Ocean City or somewhere, with Assateague or somewhere. So Pete Wagner got in with this grand plan. The money never came. And so they finally closed Crisfield, closed the Inland Laboratory at College Park, and didn't do the Ocean Research Laboratory. So this is what we came out of the process. If you've been to Horn Point, I think it's worked out remarkably well. In fact, I think there are times, there's been a history where there was some tension and rivalry. And I think the rivalry now is more the healthy nature than it is into it. And there's a lot of collaboration that takes place across faculty members here and over there. This is the DuPont property where Horn Point is. It's covered with solar farm now, but you can see the runway of the grass landing strips that Mr. DuPont had back in the day. And the other thing is the oyster hatchery is there that was supposed to be. Now, having said that, it's probably the better place for it because it takes a lot of space. And it's here at Solomon, you really don't have much in the way of that space. But what you've read about, all the remarkable things that have been done with restoration of oysters and so on, is because really it's been powered by that hatchery in an amazing way. The other thing which took place during this period as a result of these Matthias study of the Chesapeake Bay and other things, we began to focus on what Agnes told was real. And even before Agnes, we began to think is a real problem. It is over-enrichment with all this nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus from our waste and coming from farm fields and runoff. And for the dominant thought about it, based on experience in the Great Lakes and the Potomac River, is that it was a phosphorus problem. Only a phosphorus was the nutrient. And there's more evidence coming up that nitrogen was from field observations, that nitrogen was also a problem. In fact, maybe even a greater problem. And a lot of disbelief about it, a lot of pushback from The EPA pushed back from the state, that this was costly, shut up, and so on. But it was really two remarkable sets of studies, experiments, that I think really are, and Walter was actually part of both of them. One is that we had seen all the bay grasses, like the ones that are all around CBL, disappear. And they basically, it was a big controversy about what was causing it, whether it was herbicides or this nutrient problem. And so these studies in these ponds that were constructed over at Horn Point, that had space, really, I think, demonstrated pretty significantly that it was these nutrients that were clouding the water, causing algal growth on the leaves of the plants, shading the plants so that they couldn't survive. And so that needed to be addressed. And then here in the Patuxent, Chris Delia and Walter and Jim Sanders from at the Benedict Lab did these similar studies in the water column to show that you needed to address both nutrients. So this has really been seminal research that has guided our efforts to restore the bay for years. It led the study that was done. Part of the synthesis was done by Don Hanley before he left here, finished up by Chris Delia, Walter, and others, that led pretty directly to the first Chesapeake Bay Agreement in 1983. You'll see Governor Harry Hughes was here, Governor Robb from Virginia, Marion Barry, you might remember him as the mayor of DC, and Bill Ruckelshaus, who was then the head of EPA, and that first signing that first agreement. The other thing that happened in the 80s is that we had a new director. They ran Pete Wagner off, but not because of any problem in terms of how he was directing the place, but because he broke some rules with respect to how the money is supposed to be spent on buildings and so on. And he went on, by the way, to be provost at several universities. So his career wasn't hurt as a result of it. But Ian Morris was hired, and he came in. He was an oceanographer who had lots of interdisciplinary research experience and doing oceanographic work, and really led a new effort to build teams of scientists, both here at CBL and at Horn Point, who work together across disciplines on vessels to understand the big problems of the bay. Initially looking at what was coming out of the bay. Next was looking at the food chain relationships between production in the bay and the higher trophic levels that we're concerned about. And the third effort was dealing with the connection with the watershed. So really seminal work, again, to think of work that we do across disciplines, bringing them together in powerful ways. CBL, I came in 1990. I was Ian's successor. There was an interim director for 2 years. During those 2 years, by the way, the university had upheaval in university. The chancellor at the new university system, which was founded really in 1988, was kind of forced out, so there was a lot of possibilities of talking about breaking up UMCES or CES, moving Horn Point to UMES, maybe CBL to College Park, our Appalachian lab to Frostburg State, which I think would have been a terrible mistake, but didn't happen. So when that was decided, they searched and I was hired. I had to fight that battle at least. So in this period from Pete Wagner on through to me, we had several directors here. Joe Cooney, in the late 70s, Ken Tenner, as many of you know, was director here for many, many years, about 21 years. Margaret Palmer and Tom Miller. And now, as you've seen, and Karis, of course, is filled in admirably as interim director. Now we have another director to continue this tradition. During my watch, at least these buildings were built here at CBL. And now, of course, we have the new building under construction, the collaboratory. So our little small campus in miniature, I think, is stepped up, and is quite a beautiful place now to work and visit. The other thing I did is that one of the reasons I came to Maryland with UMCES is because it had upland research capacity. It wasn't just marine And I thought the problems really required a view that crossed the watersheds to coastal waters. And so I was able to, through a strange set of circumstances, you have to read the book to understand it, how dramatic it was able to move the Appalachian Lab out of a leased building on Frostburg State campus that used to be a former cafeteria. You know, our chemistry lab was in the kitchen and things of that sort, to this spectacular building that we were able to build in 1999. And then, of course, Rachel Carson, who is home ported here, currently getting a big overhaul, be back in the water during research pretty soon. It's the first vessel that we had that was really built as a research vessel. And I'm quite proud of being able to do that. We previously had the Aquarius here, which was from the Gulf of Mexico, an oil field service vessel. Served us quite well, but it wasn't built as a research vessel. It had some limitations as a result of it. The other thing is that there are just the continuing issues of controversies that came up that our laboratory, CBL, and other laboratories really stood up to and helped the state solve. One of them, as a section of the book says, it's always about oysters. Back from the time, even before Truitt, Brooks, it was about oysters, and it still comes up. So we worked on a number of, one of them is that there was this suggestion that we give up on the native oyster, the populations and the catch were so down, we should use this Asian oyster, which apparently had super qualities in terms of growth and disease resistance. And Governor Ehrlich at the time and his supporters really wanted to do this. So we built this setting facility at Horn Point. That's because he really wanted to introduce those other oysters. I knew we would need it anyway, so we went ahead with it. But here I am with Governor O'Malley. You know, it was completed, started by Governor Ehrlich, completed with Governor O'Malley. Just one example of an issue with oysters. Tom knows them well, has got some blood on his hands and forehead as a result of some of the controversies we're dealing with, as he has with blue crabs. The blue crab population, going back to the days when Truitt and his associate, who went down to be the first director of the Virginia laboratory, Curtis Newcomb, Maryland's thought about the role of harvesting and on, you know, how much you harvest and how much you leave is going to have an effect on the subsequent populations. And whereas Virginia has always thought, no, it's just nature. And so even back then, Newcomb was talking about the need to do this. So Tom led this stock assessment that we've done here for blue crabs that have been so important in managing this resource. We had a parallel organization called the Maryland Institute for Biotechnology. It has this remarkable facility for marine biotechnology on the Inner Harbor of Baltimore. The university regions decided to break up this organization because it overlapped so much with what other universities were doing. I remember the chairman of the board made a little faux pas. He said, because the term he was reading, he says to disaggregate it. And he said to desegregate the behind. So the decision was what to do with this marine biotechnology. And so the outcome was that we're kind of the major leader of that organization now, in addition to Appalachian Lab, CBL at one point, but in partnership with UMBC in Baltimore, which has engineering capabilities, as well as University of Maryland, Baltimore, which we can bring the medical related applications of marine biotechnology to bear. The other major accomplishment, I think, for many years, since the late 70s, actually, we've been a real important producer of graduate students for the university system, initially out at Frostburg, interestingly, but then since the early 80s, a system-wide multi-campus program called Marine Estuary Environmental Studies. Some of our graduate students, if they're still here, they're students in this program. And it's great because of its breadth, but it's also has deficiencies because of its breadth, that no one's really responsible or charged. And that's in part because we depend on other degree granting institutions to grant the degrees. We finally try to give us a bigger role in the leadership and direction of the program by getting our own accreditation as a degree granting institution in partnership with other institutions. So since 2014, 11 years now, we've been a degree granting institution as well in this process. This was our first graduation at the time. Ed Hood, you may know, he was our first vice president for graduate education, led this effort to get us accredited and moving forward. So finally, looking over the horizon, we can look at our traditions and honor them and build on them. So I remember I talked about Truitt not wanting to distinguish between basic research and applied research. He was thinking and working in what we call Pasteur's quadrant. So Louis Pasteur is remarkable because he had so many, basic discoveries in microbiology, but he did that with the idea is he wanted to save people's lives with respect to pasteurization, and so on. So this is called Pasteur's quadrant. We're not Thomas Edison just taking other people's inventions and discoveries and making money from it, or just purely for the love of our curiosity about how the world works. We're in Pasteur's quadrant. The second point is this point of active dissemination, working with the users of the information, the public, that we need to honor and build on. The immersion, the fact that we're not, there are advantages, there are lots of disadvantages of not being on a university campus, but there are advantages because we're immersed in the environments that we study all over the state. And so building on this concept, this idea of our taking advantage of our immersion, building a sense of community about we work, having more work in our backyard, if you will, to learn about, take advantage of that location. And then this notion of our resilience, because we've been all kinds of arrangements over the years, and we'll have more in the future. So we need to be resilient and do our work. Look at what we're dealing with now with the threats of huge cuts of research funding and so on. We need to be resilient and come out of this doing better than we went into it. And then we're still dealing, of course, with the fact is we haven't cleaned up the bay yet. We haven't met our standards. We're missed the deadline for the third time in a row. We're going to have some new goals. We need to continue that effort to try to restore the bay. But we now need to do it in a world that's changing because of climate change. So we need to be contributing not only to how we adapt to that change, but we need to be contributing at UMCES and CBL and other laboratories with how do we mitigate and how do we slow the change? How do we limit the amount of climate change that we're doing? So this puts us in the work of, I was just looking today, we have a graduate student up at our IMAT in Baltimore who is doing work on bacteria, that unique bacteria that are associated with algae that are being grown as biofuel from flue gases, from CO2 emissions. You trying to get renewable energy out of waste, and these remarkable bacteria are somehow involved in that process that allows the algae to grow and develop and produce biofuels. So this is an example of how we're not only thinking about how climate is changing and how do we adapt to it, but also how do we contribute to limiting climate change. So I want to thank everyone, the Solomons community, and see how it's changed from when, including the helicopters flying over us. So thanks everyone for your patience and interest.